Nelson's contemporaries thought he was an extraordinary man and one worthy of celebration, and there were no dissenting voices. And I certainly wouldn't be a dissenting voice myself. I mean, of all the people I've written about, he is probably the most remarkable. To, as it were, cancel Nelson, you would be cancelling him really not for something he had done or said, but for when he was born. For me, the fun of the past, I'm sure this is true for you and for lots of your listeners, the fun of the past is that precisely that it's not the present. And it's different, and people behave differently.
Hello. On the evening of the 21st of October, 1805, Britain won perhaps her finest military victory, defeating the navies of France and Spain in one of the bloodiest naval encounters at Trafalgar. In command was Admiral Horatio Nelson, who had tragically been shot by a cowardly French sharpshooter, though as his life ebbed away, he was consoled that victory was his. When the news reached England, the country was plunged into grief despite the result. Joining me to discuss the great man is Dominic Sandbrook, who I'm sure is known to many of you. He's written a fantastic new book, Nelson, Hero of the Seas, and is one half of a very well-known podcast. Coming up on Tuesday, I have naval historian Michael Barrett talking the Battle of Trafalgar on the anniversary. For those new to the pod, you'll find that all the best historians and authors joining to discuss history and their books and much more, so please do subscribe or follow. And if you can see to giving a kind and even generous review, I'd be hugely grateful. But in the meantime, it's me talking Nelson with Dominic Sandbrook. Dominic, welcome. It's a real pleasure, indeed an honour to have you on the podcast. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you. It's nice to be on a professional podcast for change. I'm sure it's not really an honour, but it's very nice of you to say so. So thank you for having me.
Well, you're very polite to say that it's professional. That's going to be very pleasing for the army of people who work on this. So we're here to talk about Nelson, Hero of the Seas, which is your latest volume in your Adventures in Time series.
Mm-hmm.
And these are fantastic. I should mention that the listenership of this podcast is generally over the age of, my statistics tell me, over the age of 45, which is
okay.
That's actually good news, because then, I mean, I've been reading this book, raced through it and loved it, but it's great for younger boys and girls as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's who these titles are really aimed at, I think, a real sort of reevaluation of not just British history, but world history, really.
Yeah, that's right. So I started writing them in 2020. They're called Adventures in Time, this series. And I had spent most of all my career writing, books for grown-ups, as it were. And at the time, my son was about 7 or 8. And I just really wanted to I couldn't quite find history books that would kindle in him the same love of the past that I had when I was a boy. So the sense of story and the driving narrative, the great characters, all of that kind of thing. So he was doing the Second World War at school. He was doing a project about evacuees. And I thought, well, the Second World War, why not start there? Why not write a book telling the story of the Second World War for readers who don't know what happens? So that was the great innovation for me as a writer. So having written history books before in which basically everybody knows that Margaret Thatcher will be elected Prime Minister in 1979 or that Britain's going to win the Falklands War or whatever, this was fun. And my editor at Penguin, same editor who works on my kind of adult, more scholarly books, he said to me, gosh, I've done so many books in which Dunkirk or D-Day happen, but never, ever worked on one where the reader doesn't know what's going to happen because it's the first time they've read this story. So we did the Second World War, we did the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, and so on and so on. I did 7 of them, some of them on things like Alexander the Great, some of them more modern. And then I was looking for a subject for number 8, and Nelson just jumped out at me because it's obviously a fantastic story. It's a brilliant window into the world of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution, Britain's rise to kind of naval greatness. slavery, obviously, the Industrial Revolution, all of these kinds of things that are happening at the same time, but also the central story, which is Nelson himself and his arc, as it were, from being a kind of boy going off to sea to standing there, on the deck of the Victory as it makes its slow, stately progression towards the enemy, the combined fleet of France and Spain at the Battle of Trafalgar. I kind of thought, come on, I mean, there's no 11-year-old in the world who won't find this a really exciting story if I get it right. So yes, I had enormous fun writing it. He's a brilliant character, and it's a great period of history.
In this country, he is probably the. I was trying to think who equals him in sort of devotion and love to a public figure.
Mm,
And as I'm reading I've just been reading about his death, and it did remind me of Princess Diana's death, the sort of public reaction and certain people who knew him,
yeah.
who were devoted to him. But there are very few like that in British public life, are there?
No, he's the paradigmatic British hero, I think. So Britannia's God of War, as he was famously called by Byron. He he inspired enormous affection among his men and his collaborators, his captains and whatnot. They knew he wasn't perfect, of course. They knew he was a character of flesh and blood. But there was something about him, a kind of star quality, that impressed itself even on, more hard-bitten people like William Pitt, the Prime Minister of the day. But I think there is enormous courage, I guess. I think he's an unusual person in that he combines a mastery of the kind of the more prosaic arts of war. So, supplying the ships, supplying his men, understanding how you fight a total war in an age of kind of globalization, which the Napoleonic age is. He knows how the Admiralty works. He's able to command men. He's able to understand the system, all of that stuff, right? But on top of that, lots of people have a bit of that, but he has this extraordinary, almost superhuman physical courage. So at some of his battles, Cape St. Vincent, for example, or indeed Trafalgar, the fact that he's putting himself in harm's way, storming ships, leading his men into the heart of the action at great risk to himself. Even at the time, I think people found that mind-boggling, that you could combine so many different talents. So, as you rightly say, when he dies in 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, obviously the most crushing victory in British naval history, secures control of the seas for Britain for generations to come, for 100 years or more. But when the news gets back to Britain, the joy at the victory is almost overshadowed by the outpouring of grief and sorrow at Nelson's death, and the state funeral that he has at the beginning of 1806, I think it is. Is it beginning of 1806? Let me just do I'll do some live research. Yes, it's January 1806. My mind went, that moment when you think you know something, and then you have a sudden moment of terror that you've shamed yourself in front of all your podcast listeners.
I know, I would edit that. I'm far too kind to my guests.
Oh no, you should leave that in. I think everybody should know that everybody has feet of clay, even Nelson. So the funeral, it's a grey day, and the mood of complete mourning and genuine sadness. People felt that Nelson was even people who didn't know him, were not within a million miles of knowing him, felt a personal connection. And there's very few people in British history, I think probably only Churchill, his funeral in 1965, that come close, becoming not just a remarkable individual, but the personification of national resistance to a kind of overweening enemy, in this case, Napoleonic France. So yeah, he's an incredible character, actually.
Yeah, and his contemporary, the Duke of Wellington, who he met when he was Sir Arthur Wellesley, it's not the same level. Wellington can't reach those heights, I don't think. He's not loved by his men like Nelson is loved, is he?
No. Wellington is probably in some ways a harder taskmaster. He's more remote from his men. Of course, Wellington, he lives longer. He becomes prime minister, a very reactionary prime minister in many ways. So he's not a romantic figure, as Nelson is. There's always this kind of glamour about Nelson, even though in reality, when people met him, they were quite surprised that he was kind of short and slender. He's also quite sickly. So he doesn't, in a way that makes him more heroic, right? That because he is physically frail, his courage is all the more remarkable. But also people, I mean, Wellington's a great example. Wellington met him in Downing Street. Nelson is going into and out of meetings just before he goes off Trafalgar. And Wellington says he meets Nelson. He's so disappointed because Nelson is so, I think, vain and silly is his expression. He's just talking about himself. Nelson could be incredibly conceited. And then Nelson clearly went out of the room, asked somebody who this was, realized it was Sir Arthur Wellesley, comes back in, and then they talk about strategy. And Nelson and Wellington said afterwards, he was really intelligent. He was absolutely fascinating talking to him about geopolitical strategy. I don't think I ever had a conversation that interested me more, I think is his line.
And he wasn't given to hyperbole.
No, not at all. Exactly. So I think, maybe there's a tiny element of kind of back projection there, but perhaps only a little one. The truth of the matter is, although Nelson could be very infuriating to his superiors, because he does have this star quality and a sense of his own star quality and his destiny, which means that as a subordinate, as part of if he's a cog in your machine, he's a very annoying cog because he's always pestering you and moaning and whatnot. But to his men, he's genuinely inspirational. The way in which they mourn him after he falls at Trafalgar, the way in which the captains who've not served with him before, they write back during that campaign home. And they say, I've been invited to dine with Lord Nelson on board his ship. It was brilliant. Nelson, what I always, have looked forward to this. And it was even better than I thought because he's a brilliant host. He's so interesting. He's inspirational. I think it's like the people who are great football managers or team leaders or whatever. He has that touch. The Nelson touch. He is able to touch the souls of the people he works with and to kindle a kind of fire there in his band of brothers, as he called them. And, it's always tempting as a historian to be a little bit cynical about that and to say, oh, it's all romantic fantasy or whatever. But I think there are too many sources that agree on it to question it. I think charisma is really important in history, and he's a brilliant example of it.
There's a kind of serendipity to Nelson in that the Royal Navy is really the place where someone like him could thrive. I mean, if he had joined the army, he'd have been constrained by the purchase system.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes, of course,
who knows what would have happened. So he's a middle class person who is able to rise up the ranks quickly through talent.
Yes, that's right. So the Navy, I mean, you do need connections in the Navy, and he does have them. His uncle Morris, who's his Captain Suckling, who first really gets him in, and he attaches himself to a succession of patrons, so captains, and then later admirals. Sir John Jervis, later the Earl of St. Vincent, for example. So people who recognise his talent and promote him. But you're absolutely right. The Navy is a genuine meritocracy. It's tough to get on the captain's list, and connections matter, of course, but you will be found out. The Navy is unforgiving. You will be found out if you're not good, and if you are good, you have a good chance of getting ahead. So actually writing this book for younger readers, I thought about it's a classic kind of device in children's fiction, for example. Somebody going away to sea or going to finding themselves in an unfamiliar kind of system. It could be a boarding school, for example, in Harry Potter, and they have to learn the ropes. Learn the ropes, perfect example, naval expression. We get it from the Royal Navy. They have to learn how the system works, and if they're good, they will thrive. This is exactly what happened to Nelson. He, like so many midshipmen, he learns, the sextant, the compass, all of that stuff. He learns geography. He learns the tides. He's taught history. He is taught how to dance. He gets all these things from his various patrons. And at any point, if he's not good, he will either sink or he will just stop. He will stop rising. But, as you say, the Navy, which is, I think at that point, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's the most sophisticated bureaucracy of any kind in the world. It is probably the most sophisticated machine of any kind. I mean, it has manufacturers, as they were called, like the rope works or the blocks works or whatever, that are ahead of their time. And if you are a scientifically minded, intrepid, ambitious, curious person, you will do well. And he does do well, and that's not just because he has this one uncle who's advanced him. Because as you say, he's not from a particularly brilliant, outstanding family. He comes from Burnham Thorpe. He's a vicar's son from Norfolk. His mother's family are connected with the Walpoles, but quite tangentially. I mean, he grows up in provincial obscurity. So he's a brilliant example, actually, of the meritocratic, if the boy made good.
It's quite funny reading about his childhood, particularly because it seems as though he gets his healthy hatred of the French
Yes,
from his mother.
He does. He does. She couldn't abide the French. And he said later on, she couldn't stand the French. And he wouldn't have a Frenchman on his ship, I think, unless he was a prisoner. He did go to France as a young man. He visited and was very disappointed with it. He thought he was shocked, he said, by the extremes of wealth, which kind of surprises me. But yeah, I guess the thing is, he grows up at a time. So he's born in 1758. He grows up in a time when Britain, the country of kind of Great Britain, is 50 years old or so. Opposition to France is a crucial building block of British identity. So he's grown up with that. The 7 Years' War, of course, the great landmark moment in the evolution of Britain into world power, happens when he is, a boy, a very little boy. It's in everybody's mind. It's on everybody's lips. And then the first war really that he's involved in, the American War of Independence, where the French very perfidiously, I have to say, join in on the wrong side. So he has, I think it's fair to say, a very healthy disdain for the French and a sense that they are the ultimate enemy, which is not wrong, right? I mean, Britain and France in this period are locked in a titanic superpower conflict for maritime supremacy, for markets, for trade, for influence worldwide. And certainly by 1805 or so, there is a sense that this is now, the gloves are off, as it were, that Napoleon is really going for it. And on that battle at Trafalgar, if that goes wrong, and if Napoleon's fleet, I don't think Napoleon can realistically conquer Britain, but what he can certainly do is to, sail up the channel, do horrendous damage to Britain's shipyards, dockyards, basically despoil and destroy Britain's naval infrastructure. And that would have left Britain, I think, extremely vulnerable. And who knows, the history of the 19th century and beyond might have been very different.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we do have some French listeners.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, well, I've been doing my best to reduce the number, and I think this would be another nail in the coffin.
Right.
But I was wondering, you mentioned early on that Nelson isn't perfect, which may come as news to some.
Yeah, disappointing, heretical, I know.
Yes, but I wanted to speak to you about Naples because I had grown up, I think, with the Ladybird book.
Yeah.
And I don't think Naples is mentioned.
No room. I mean, why put it in? It'd be a shame to put it in.
So I guess I wasn't a huge aficionado of Nelson. So then I read the Barry Unsworth novel. I don't know if you've read this.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is brilliant.
Yeah.
And I was like, what about this episode? Which actually, and you deal with it very well in the book. And I think in a very balanced, which I do like. But I think in all honesty, it's difficult for him to emerge from that with a huge amount of credit.
Yeah, so to give people a sense, he's been sent to Naples, which is run by this horrendous oaf, King Ferdinand, and his wife, Maria Carolina, who's a bit of a diva, I think it's fair to say. And he's under orders. Naples is one of Britain's very few allies in the Mediterranean. And that's really important because you need supplies, you need a place to go. If all friendly ports are knocked out, as the French have already done with Livorno or Genoa or whatever, then if you're friendless in the Mediterranean, then life becomes very difficult. So he has been told by his superiors in London, you absolutely must be on the right side of the Neapolitan regime. And he arrives, and these terrible clowns decide, who are running this very flamboyant and corrupt and reactionary regime, they decide that this is after the Battle of the Nile. They're like, brilliant, Napoleon's clearly on his uppers. Let's launch this campaign and march north, liberate lots more of Italy. Off they go. It's a total shambles. They've all spent far too much time thinking about the flamboyance of their uniforms and not how they'll actually win. They're basically beaten back out of Rome. And then there's a revolution in Naples, total sort of scenes of chaos. And Nelson and the Neapolitan court all have to flee to Palermo in Sicily. Eventually, after a long series of machinations, which we don't need to go into, they return to Naples. And Naples in the interim had been taken over by people who are called the Jacobins. They're kind of called the Neapolitan Jacobins. So they're kind of Neapolitan intellectuals, kind of do-gooders, people who kind of fancy themselves as the heirs to the French Revolution, or writers, poets, all this kind of thing. And these guys all end up effectively as Nelson's prisoners. And they had previously been promised safe conduct to France. So he's got, but the King of Naples and the Queen are saying, oh no, please execute, all these people must be punished. So he's torn, I think, between the fact that these people have sort of been given sort of his word, but it's somebody else's word ultimately, but he's inherited that commitment. But also he can't go against, or he thinks he can't go against the King and Queen. And let's be honest, a lot of his officers are really shocked that he goes with the King and Queen. And he says, no, these people must be punished. They're the most terrible people. And a lot of them are executed, and there are sort of these scenes of carnage as these people are executed. And back home in Britain, people, particularly Whigs, who were maybe slightly more sympathetic to the cause of reform and whatnot, said, my God, Nelson has gone native. He's working for these terribly corrupt people. Of course, this is partly under the influence of Emma Hamilton, who's very close to the Queen. And they say Nelson's really let himself down. And so for more Whiggish inclined writers, I think it's always been a black mark against Nelson. The fact that he colluded in the repression of these kind of revolutionaries. Biographers who are perhaps more conservatively minded, I think there's Andrew Lambert, great naval historian, is one of them, say, well, these people were obviously total revolutionaries and rogues, and, it's kind of kill or be killed. Nelson did the right thing. These people have rebelled against their rightful king. They had to go. They had to... I think actually both of those are reasonable viewpoints, right? I mean, you could say a man of honor, as some of Nelson's colleagues did, a man of honor should have said to the King and Queen of Naples, forget it. We've given them our word. These people have safe conduct back to France. That's the honorable, it's the British thing to do. That would have possibly created a breach with the Neapolitan regime, which would have been bad for Britain. But maybe that would have been the honorable thing to do. On the other hand, you can say, come on, if you lead a revolution and you lose, the outcome is not going to be good. Don't get into revolutionary business if you don't want this to happen to you. And Nelson had no choice. For me, writing this, I did wrestle with this because I knew it was such a big controversy. And I thought, I'm glad to hear you when you described the chapter, because I thought, if I'm writing about this and it's the first time an 11-year-old or whatever has read about it, I should basically give them both viewpoints and say to them, you decide what you think. It's up to you. It's not up to me to lecture you. I think there's both sides have some merit. And I think actually I quite like doing that when I'm writing for younger readers, because I think sometimes it's not to be evasive. Personally, I don't really care about the Jacobins, so I think I'm quite happy that he did it. But I don't think it's my place to brainwash my young readers into being as reactionary as I am. So I think they can make up their own minds.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. Interesting. Is that Is that partly why you've written the series? Because I know you mentioned at the beginning that you were looking for books for young people,
Yeah.
and we're at a stage now where books for children and for or for younger people are not. There is a sort of there seems to be an underlying message in a lot of
Yeah.
younger history books.
Yeah, completely. Completely. I was talking about this with my agent at the time, my literary agent, because he has kids of the same age as my son. And we were kicking around ideas. And he was saying, his kids hated these kind of books. They felt patronized them or lectured them. Books that sort of said, oh, it's all about moralistic lessons, how to be a better person and stuff. I mean, you mentioned, I think earlier on, the Ladybird books. There was absolutely no element of them that was like, this will make you a kinder person. It's like, here's the story, that's it. And I thought, for me, the fun of the past, I'm sure this is true for you and for lots of your listeners. The fun of the past is that precisely that it's not the present and it's different and people behave differently. And there have been times in the books, for example, I did one about the conquistadors and the Aztecs. I mean, there's a lot of what we might consider quite bad behavior in that book, whether it's the Aztecs sacrificing people on top of pyramids or the Spanish slaughtering loads of Aztecs. But I sort of made a point of saying, just not in a sort of overly didactic way, but as an aside, we should remember that, they were living in a world that was in an imaginative and moral world that was different from our own. And we shouldn't impose our own, sensibility on them. We should let them be themselves. And of course we can judge, but we should let them be themselves first. And then we can make our minds up. But it's also not for me as a historian to kind of be the primary school teacher at the sort of assembly giving you a really moralistic Sunday school style lesson. If nothing else, I think it's very boring for kids to read that kind of thing. So yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly my thinking, which is not who likes being lectured. I don't think even people who are students at lectures really enjoy being lectured. And they definitely don't enjoy being lectured if they're 11 years old and they're reading a book about the excitement and the complexity and the variety of the past. They don't want a sort of finger-wagging moralistic judge as the narrator. So I try to do that as little as possible.
Yeah, that's great. I read so many books for the job, and there are a few that, when you realize early on that there is a kind of moralizing undertone, it's just,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
frustrating. But if we go back to Nelson, I think perhaps we could all agree his treatment of his wife was...
Yeah. Poor.
Yeah, so if
Shocking,
the poor old
actually.
Jacobins, get it in the neck, that's fine. But he treated Fanny terribly.
He did. He was terrible to Fanny. That was actually a much bigger issue for me than the thing in Naples. It's a funny thing with children as readers, actually. So they will tolerate a lot of bad behavior towards other combatants. They think that's fine. But but it was clear to me right away that having him treat his wife so badly was something I would have to think about how to handle it. Because the readers think of him as the hero of the story. He's the protagonist. And if 2/3 of the way through he disgraces himself, which he did, he carried on with Anne Hamilton in Sicily and in Naples. They come back to England. She's pregnant by the time they return. They arrive in England. I mean, all of this is, I think it's fair to say, it's bad behavior, but it's not unprecedented, right? I mean, stuff happens. To me, the shocking thing is how he then treats Fanny, his wife. He's so cold to her. He's so cruel. He sends her these letters breaking off the relationship as though he is addressing a member of his crew who has transgressed in some obscure way, has been cast off and left on land. That's how he treats Fanny. And Emma is also extremely unpleasant about Fanny behind her back to the Nelson's family. So Fanny, who is a sort of, perhaps if you were being harsh, you would say a slightly humdrum person, but a very sweet-natured person and a kind of gentle person. Probably not the perfect match for Nelson, who is a bit of a diva himself and very driven and ambitious. However, she has been so supportive to him all his life. And for him to treat her as badly as he does, I think to me, that's actually by far the worst thing he does in his life. Because this is a person to whom he owes a great deal. She has cared for him when he has been injured. For example, when he came home having, lost his arm. She has looked after him. She has waited for him all this time. And then he kind of casts her aside in this very, very cold way. I mean, again, it's not an unprecedented situation. I mean, this happens in life. But I think it's reasonable to say he treats her badly. And when I was writing this and thinking about writing it for 11-year-old or 10-year-old or whatever readers whose own lives may have had similar kinds of, people have complicated families, I thought it would be weird not to say out loud, this is very bad behavior. We can all agree he treated Fanny very badly. I mean, again,
it's also public as well.
It's so public. So she's humiliated. They're in cartoons. Everybody knows about it. I mean, the one thing I suppose you would say, which is a slight consolation, is that everybody takes her side, and people are always generally nice about her, except for Emma, of course, and Emma's cronies, such as they are. But yeah, it's a real humiliation for Fanny, and I sort of didn't massively want to take sides, but it was almost difficult not to be honest, because to me, I actually think, I know some of your listeners may think Emma Hamilton's brilliant, but I actually think she was a terrible person. And I know that had I ever met her, I would have absolutely hated her, as so many of Nelson's fellow officers did, actually. By and large, they couldn't stand Emma, and they thought Fanny had been very badly treated. And I think they were probably good judges.
Yeah, I think Blackadder says it quite well, doesn't he?
As he does, I can't remember the exact line.
I think before the Battle of Nile, not true, listeners, but before the Battle of the Nile, Nelson said, England knows Lady Hamilton's a virgin. Take out my eye, cut off my arm if I'm wrong.
Yeah. I mean, Emma Hamilton had a tough life.
Oh, it's miserable at the end.
She had a really miserable life at the beginning.
Right.
I mean, she's sort of exchanged by various powerful men as their mistress when she's very young, and she's come from a very poor background. Then she ends up in Naples with Sir William Hamilton, and that's all fine. Like, he's off inspecting his vases and thinking about Vesuvius, and he's 180 or whatever, and she's much younger. But he treats her very kindly, and they have then a nice kind of relationship. And then, sure, she has this relationship with Nelson, but she's so horrible to Fanny. I think that is the thing that she's so graceless. And when Nelson's captains would go and visit their house in Merton, and I mean, there's some very funny accounts by people kind of turning up and saying, "God, it's awful when you go." She literally just talks about herself the whole time. The whole place is a shrine to them. We all know people like that, right? Sort of burning with ego, which Emma and Nelson clearly are. And I can well imagine that going to a dinner party, Shay, Nelson, and Emma would have been a bit of a trial.
But this is what's so interesting to me, that with all this sort of bubbling around in his life, and then he goes off, I think, Copenhagen afterwards.
Yeah,
and then,
Copenhagen afterwards, exactly.
Where I guess this is sort of a tactical decision, so understandable, where he ignores authority in where he famously puts the telescope to his eye. And then Trafalgar afterwards, and I feel awful because we spent about 25 minutes slagging Nelson off, basically. But with all this sort of drama going on in his private life, going to sea is really his salvation.
It is. He's best at sea. And actually, when he leads and does anything on land, it's always disastrous. So when he leads kind of raids and stuff, he's just no good on land. He spent too long at sea. Yeah, absolutely. He goes off to Copenhagen. He's incredibly depressed. He's miserable. He's worried about his health, which is always breaking down. And then he completely redeems himself at Copenhagen. Sir Hyde Parker, who is the kind of commander of the expedition, is basically pretty useless. He's also got a colourful private life because he's just got married to somebody much younger than himself, and he basically just wants to spend all his time with her. But he's also a very timid commander, which is why he says to Nelson, break off the attack in Copenhagen, when Nelson's really getting stuck in against all these kind of shore batteries and forts and things. And Nelson does, as you say, that famous thing, the telescope to the wrong eye. He says to Foley, I have a right to be blind sometimes. I really do not see the signal, and all of that stuff. Nelson does brilliantly at Copenhagen. It's a great bit of seamanship. to sail around all these shoals, to take on the batteries, all of that stuff. Great diplomacy to get the Danes back on side once you've basically battered their city, to then go ashore, reach a deal with the Danes. He does all that really, really well. And I think sort of psychologically, you can imagine the scene. He is had such a troubled time. He's just broken up with Fanny. He's got Emma, pregnant, back in Britain, making him the butt of so much scandal, all these jokes, all these cartoons, all of that. Then he goes away. And I think it's once he's away, as soon as the land fades into the background behind him, it's as though all that is gone, and he's able to throw himself back into the routine. I have to say, now that I said, although that's all gone, that's actually not quite true, because he's also sending Emma a load of bonkers letters when he's gone off to sea, which are very comical. And I did think about, are these right for the young readers? And I thought, no, they'll find them funny, because he's obsessed with the future George IV, because George IV is also courting Emma. And Nelson is sending these slightly sort of feverish, jealous letters. Don't let that fellow near you. I know what a dog he is, all that kind of thing. Letter after letter. I imagine you with him, all this. Oh, terrible scenes, whatever. But I think the further he gets from Britain, the more he sort of sorts himself out and forgets it. And certainly when he's in the thick of the action, all the private turbulence is banished, and he's able to concentrate on the task in hand, and to do it quite brilliantly.
I did enjoy your description of the Prince Regent as an exceptionally greedy and selfish man.
Yeah,
I love the Prince Regent. Disappointed you're not a fan.
Oh no, well,
I mean, he's so hopeless that I can't help but like him.
I completely get that. He's a great character to write about. I mean, you can't deny that he was an exceptionally greedy and selfish man, right? You can still like him.
No, not at all.
I'm happy with that. I don't mind you. I mean, he's obviously a terrible man, but often they're the most fun people in history, aren't they? People who are very badly behaved in various sort of baroque ways. Yeah,
that's why I like this period of history. Is that there are so many characters like this. You mentioned Byron at the start. There's Beau Beaumont. All they're all just larger than life, and they seem it's pre-Victorian era. So
I was just about to say that.
Right.
You took the words out of my mouth. Exactly right. I think it's because it's pre-Victorian, and so they don't have the inhibitions that later generations would have that stop them behaving in these absolutely flagrant and disgraceful ways. So if you want to be the Prince Regent and have a kind of 50-inch waist or whatever, and have like pork for breakfast and all of that, this is the age to do it. People will perhaps judge you a little bit, but it's not completely outlandish. Whereas if you're doing it in the 1850s, I mean, people would definitely judge you for that. So there's something really fun, I think, about this period, because it is the kind of, it's the Regency. It's an age of romance, of glamour, of a kind of, if you even look at the cartoons, the nudity, the scatological humor in the cartoons, there is an unbridled sensuality, I guess, to British life in the 1790s and 1800s it's fun. It makes it really, really fun to write about. It's not austere. There's no hint of austerity to it. And I think I imagine if you're, again, to go back to the book, if you're maybe 12 or so, it's a fun and flamboyant period. Certainly more fun and flamboyant than our own period, I would say. Well, we're much more like the Victorians. We're more judgmental and more moralistic. But they weren't at all in Nelson's day.
Yes, it's a sad state of affairs. Going back to Nelson then, and his, I guess, love of his men, and also the kind of fun element you were just mentioning is, I was doing some calculations, because I noted that you had mentioned there were, I think, 1 million gallons of beer.
Right.
That's around 9,000 men in the fleet. So I did some calculations, and that works out at around 7.3 pints per day for each sailor.
Wow.
I'm not a mathematician, I should say, so I might have made a mistake, but I think that's right. So that's over 7 pints a day per sailor in
But
the
I don't
fleet.
think they're drinking that much per day. I don't think they're by any means. I mean, that was
No, but that's oh no, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm saying that that's what 1 million gallons for
looks
the
like.
fleet works
Yeah,
out as.
yeah,
Which does sound that when they, I'm sure they're not doing that every day, but when they are doing it,
they're getting stuck
they're
in.
going to have a riotous time. And
Yeah,
Nelson's ensuring that he's providing for them in the ways that they need to be.
that's right. Yeah, I think actually that's a huge part of his life as a commander is actually keeping on top of all of this stuff. So it's not just about kind of picking your moment to attack the French. Actually, his day to day life, an awful lot of it is made up with writing letters and fussing over paperwork with his secretaries about, where are we going to get lemons, let's say, or oranges or whatever? Where are we going to get meat? Where are we going to get fresh water, which is really important? So that infrastructure, I mean, one of the interesting things to me about Nelson, because you can obviously say with history, oh, history is too often reduced to the actions of great men, and of these sort of characters. But I think what's the interesting thing about him is that he is the symbol of a much bigger machine. So only Britain has the infrastructure to supply all that beer to all those people, to have supply ships crossing the seas, bringing all this stuff from Britain to the fleet in the Mediterranean. And it's why the Navy is so successful. In a weird way, that detail about the beer in your calculations is indicative of the strength of Britain's war effort. Because if you don't have the infrastructure, the economy, the industrial capacity, the bureaucratic capacity to do all those things, then you will have angry sailors who will mutiny, or people, they won't want to join up, and they won't fight as well. Nelson prides himself. He has crews that are pumped up, that are happy, that really believe in him and the effort, and also crews. Interestingly, I mean, it might sound counterintuitive given how much beer there is, but they
Yes.
are probably the healthiest, some of the healthiest Britons alive at that point, because he is making sure they have fresh fruit, that they have enough food to eat, that they have water, that they have all these things. But actually, if you're an agricultural labourer in Britain, or if you're working in one of these new factories, you don't have all of these kinds of things. So they are fitter, in better condition, healthier, probably than anybody else in the world at that point.
Yes, it's so interesting that because I was chatting with, I'm sure you're aware, Nam Rogers' third volume
Yeah.
of is out, and I was speaking to him yesterday, and it seems as though Nelson's great victory at Trafalgar, which then allows Britain to dominate the seas, and is even though this isn't what Rogers' thrust of his book is, but
Hmm.
just the overarching viewpoint really that Britain then doesn't have to worry about a competitor at sea for the next 100 odd years. And that's down to Nelson's victory. And then a malaise develops in the Royal Navy, and they lose that kind of logistical ability, and they become quite amateurish. I was reading about, and I guess paradoxically, it's you can lay that well, it's not Nelson's fault he died, but it's down to his victory that the Royal Navy then did sort of tread water.
Yeah, I guess it treads water. I mean, it's a sort of strange maritime expression, but for this situation. But I guess if they do tread water, that's born of success, right? It's born of complacency, because once they've won at Trafalgar, they've beaten the world's next two fleets combined, then the combined fleet of France and Spain. They have secured Britain from any possibility of invasion. They are now in a position to be able to blockade the French if they want to basically starve Napoleon out. It takes a long time, but that's what drives him to try to create this continental system and whatnot. And in the long run, so over the decades, Britain, it's extraordinary to think just how preeminent Britain is. Britain basically lacks a serious competitor until the emergence of the Imperial German fleet at the turn of the 20th century, which is why the emergence of the Kaiser's fleet is such a big psychological shock, I suppose. Seen as such an affront, isn't it? But yeah, we have a great long period of success, or treading water, as you call it, based on his victory, which is not a fluke, right? That's the thing about Trafalgar. Trafalgar was probably always going to happen because the British, he knew the reason he's able to force that battle, and the reason he wants to do it is because he just knows we will win, because he knows the British fleet are the best gunners, they're the best trained, they're the fittest, the ships are the best. He thinks, unless he really cocks it up in some incredibly bizarre way, victory is effectively inevitable. I know I don't like to use the word inevitable, but you know what I mean. And that's partly him and his command and his vision, but it's also the underlying kind of structural things that mean that the Royal Navy would have been hard pressed, I think, ultimately to lose that battle.
But you write about this in the book. Victories like that weren't that common. I mean,
no, that's right.
You just sort of sailed past each other, firing it.
Yeah, you did. And I think part of that is because you know that this hardware is very expensive. You don't want to risk it. And, battles at sea are horrendous. I mean, every naval historian who's ever written about this will make this point, that to be below decks in the dark with the smoke and the soot and the heat, you're stripped to the waist often, pouring with sweat, and every time the enemy hits you, splinters arcing, cartwheeling through the air, taking people's heads off, embedding in people's skulls, ripping eyes out, the deck slippery with blood, all of that kind of thing. Given all that, and given the cost of the ships and the what you stand to lose if you lose one, a lot of captains are cautious. The extraordinary thing about Nelson is that basically we talk about him as a great tactician or a great strategist, but the truth is his tactics are often the same, which are, let's just go straight at them, go straight at them, take them on and annihilate the enemy. And that's unusual in the context of the time, because a lot of people don't want to do that. They, as you say, they're like, well, we'll kind of sail past them and shoot at them. And he finds that very frustrating, I think. So when he has older commanders in the 1790s, when he's in the Mediterranean, who are...
Well, you're not going to have a go at Samuel Hood, are you?
No, I'm not going to have a go at Samuel Hood. I was going to go as a guy called, I think his name is Hotham. Is it Hotham?
Right. That's good. Okay.
And he's a decent guy, but he's cautious. He doesn't want to pursue the enemy. He's like, well, what we have, we hold. And Nelson chafes at that. He dreams of a battle of total annihilation. And that's what he's been planning before Trafalgar, in the months before Trafalgar, when he's showing people his plan. What do you think of it? Oh, it will be, I think it will really surprise everybody. And when he tells his captains, he has them to these meetings, these sort of dinners, and he says, this is the plan. We will basically go at them. We will smash their line. We'll deal with each bit, and then we'll mop up the rest. They say, oh, brilliant. I've been waiting all my life to hear someone come up with a plan like this.
That's brilliant. Well, we're running out of time. So I know that you do mention towards the end of the book, and I've been reading this recently, but I don't know how seriously to take it.
Yeah.
I suspect not. This is where you have modern, I think it's commentators. I don't know if there are any serious historians who genuinely think that Nelson is, I guess he was an admiral in the Royal Navy during the period of the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, kind of, an arm of colonialism.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone seriously, a historian writing about this period would seriously suggest that, because he was, for the most part, fighting the French in an attempt to, defend Britain in many of those engagements.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what happened is that particularly after 2020, so sort of the peak of the sort of George Floyd murder and the reaction to that people, sort of activists, as it were looking for icons to topple. And Nelson, because he's a commander, obviously during the age of slavery, was a tempting target, as Churchill obviously is. I mean, they're the two, they stand unrivaled, I think, as the kind of icons of Britishness, British martial prowess.
Quite literally, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people, sort of professional critics, as it were, are able to point to a couple of things. Number one is the fact that Nelson served in the Caribbean, and he had a lot to do with colonists in the Caribbean who owned plantations and slaves. Fanny, his wife, comes from that background. And there is, I would say, no doubt whatsoever that Nelson is not an abolitionist. There's no record of Nelson being an abolitionist, and he clearly wasn't one. There is also this letter that has floated around which was almost certainly doctored after his death by advocates of slavery to make it look as though Nelson was more vociferous in defense of slavery than in reality he was. I think as a man of his time, as quite a conservative person, a very kind of king and country person, as somebody who is engaged in the defense of the British Empire and spends a lot of time thinking about the sort of sinews of British economic might and defending British influence from the French, I think Nelson clearly was not an abolitionist, would never have been an abolitionist. However, he's not a slaver. He never transports slaves. He doesn't profit from slavery personally. He doesn't conquer anybody. He doesn't take any colonies. He never writes or says anything that we would consider racist. So we have a lot of what Nelson wrote. We know lots about, we have lots of letters. There is nothing in them. There's no smoking gun. There's nothing of that kind. So in a way, to, as it were, cancel Nelson, you would be cancelling him really not for something he had done or said, but for when he was born and for the age in which he lived, which seems to me an unbelievably unreasonable approach to take to anybody who lived in the past. So, yes, I don't think any serious Nelson scholar would take any of that seriously at all. Of course, there are people living in that period who we would look at now, look very askance at. So people who, for example, had cold-bloodedly profited from the exploitation and the suffering of other people. Nelson is never remotely in that league. He's a conservative-minded person living in an age when what we now regard as a cruel and exploitative system is up and running, and he doesn't question it or criticize it. Now, if you want to take against him based on that, I guess you can, but I think it's a very harsh standard to apply to somebody who's no longer around to explain himself. And as I say in the book, especially for young readers coming to this story for the first time, how would you feel about our successors judging us using the same unbelievably exacting moral standards? I mean, I frankly would find that terrifying. I think most of us would. So yeah, I think Nelson's contemporaries thought he was an extraordinary man and one worthy of celebration, and there were no dissenting voices. And I certainly wouldn't be a dissenting voice myself. I mean, of all the people I've written about, he is probably the most remarkable.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's certainly no cancellation happening on this podcast.
Yeah,
I mean, I actually was deciding whether to put, this might upset you, it was between Nelson and Napoleon to put on the logo. We've got 4 historical figures on the logo.
Yeah.
Alexander's there, you'll be pleased to hear.
That's brilliant. I like Alexander a lot. Yeah.
But Napoleon, I think, just because of his impact on the era.
That's so disappointing.
I know.
That's so disappointing. Napoleon, you see, was a terrible man. I mean, Napoleon is not a warm man. Napoleon's very
history.
corrupt.
There are terrible people in
There are. But I mean, come on. Aspects of history has got to be better than that.
It's an aspect.
Yeah, I guess it is.
This has been brilliant. Thank you. Links are in the show notes for listeners. This is a fantastic book. Christmas is coming. I should be, I don't think, my nephew claims he listens to this. This will be I shall be getting him this as his present.
Brilliant.
He needs to write me a thank you letter for the last one.
Right. Well, no one likes writing thank you letters, do you?
No. Thanks very much, Dominic.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for listening. Our Nelson Trafalgar mini-series concludes on Tuesday as I have naval historian Michael Barrett discussing the Battle of Trafalgar itself. Plenty more great history and historians on the way, but until then, thank you and good night.